I don't know, everyone here has an interesting story to share. So I would like to introduce our speaker today, Bruce D. in Seattle.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bruce. I am an alcoholic. I live in Seattle, Washington. So a real quick heads up here. We have a wind advisory up today, and when we have wind advisory up and wind advisories up, we typically lose power. That happened to us yesterday. Today, we're still forecasted for that. So if all of a sudden I'm not here, don't take it personally. It isn't an act of God. It's an act of nature. so that's the heads up for now. Okay, so first of all, thank you, BriJet, for inviting me to speak here. Secondly, thank you, Courtney, for creating this space for all of us to be in. I love Secular Recovery Group. I love everything about it, and I'm just really fortunate to be here. This is my home. Well, I won't call it my home group. It's my home groups, plural. I mean, every time I'm in a meeting here, I'm in what I consider to be my home group now. So that's how SRG works for me. So my understanding is that what I should talk about today is what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. So let me begin. Okay, what it was like. All right. One of the things that's interesting for me, and one of the things in my background that is not what I typically hear in AA meetings. I've been going to, my recovery date is January 6, 1999. So I've been going to AA meetings for a little while. One of the things that I've heard a lot when I go to AA meetings is that people who share about their backgrounds talk about the fact that they come from alcoholic families. Somebody in their family drank, or everybody in their family drank, or their culture drank, or whatever it was. And so it was very natural for them to have access to and get involved in drinking. That was not my experience. Nobody in my family drank. And I never really understood why alcohol was so interesting to me, and had almost no interest at all to the members of my family. I grew up in a home with 4 generations, none of whom drank. So it was an interesting thing for me. The first time I had unrestricted access to alcohol, I was 13 years old. I drank myself into a blackout. The next time I had unrestricted access to alcohol, I was 15 years old. I drank myself into a blackout. My experience of those early experiences with alcohol was that I found my best friend. It was like magic. Alcohol was magic to me. I drank, and from the moment I drank, I felt better. And I wanted to chase that, but I really couldn't because, again, I didn't have access. When I finally had access, I was 18 years old. That was when I started going to college. I went to a college that had just built off-campus dorms. The dorms were populated by a lot of people who were over 21 years old. I could get all the alcohol I could afford to buy. So the bottom line with that one is I drank, to condense that part of the story, I drank alcoholically pretty much out of the gate from the time I was 18 for the next 35 years. And that was off and on, but it was mostly on. During that period of time, I had a few times where I was able to get sober and stay sober for a while, but I never had a program to do that with. And the pure fact of the matter is that during that time, I never really wanted to stop drinking. Not really, not in my heart. I love drinking. I love getting high. I always drank to get high. I never drank. I was not a social drinker. Most of the times, if I was going to a party, I would go to the party drunk to make sure that there would be enough alcohol for me to consume before I got there. Because I couldn't trust that once I got there, there might not be enough there for me to get high. Getting high was the thing for me. I'm a product of the 60s, and there were plenty of other drugs involved in my experience. But the interesting thing about it is that none of them stuck. I smoked a lot of dope. I did a lot of other various and sundry chemicals. But at the end of the day, I started with alcohol and I ended with alcohol. And alcohol seemed to be, during that 35-year stretch, the only thing I really couldn't stop doing. Everything else just sort of peeled off naturally, but alcohol, no, alcohol was with me from the beginning pretty much to the end. So the next question then becomes, well, what happened? What happened is, about the time I was in my 50s, it's a family story. I didn't get a nudge from the judge to get into Alcoholics Anonymous. It was enough for me to be on the precipice of losing everything I claimed mattered to me and actually did matter to me. My marriage, my home, my relationship with my child, all of those things were on the line by the time I got to AA. And the story of my actually being willing to come into AA, a little bit more. I actually did, during that 35-year run, try AA. I went to one AA meeting, probably, I don't know, maybe 20 years. I was maybe in my late 30s, early 40s kind of thing. Went to an AA meeting, and there's only 3 things I remember about that meeting. 1, cigarette smoke, because you could smoke back then. 2, God, which never really clung to me. That concept really never was important to me. And 3, how the hell do I get out of here? Those were my only memories from my first AA meeting. And I got out of that meeting and I never went back. Well, didn't go back for a long, long time. All right, so what happened? So what happened was, about the age of 14 and a half, and oh, by the way, I had stopped drinking. I had stopped drinking for 5 years. When my wife got pregnant with my daughter, I promised I would stop drinking, and I did. I did a 5-year run, no program, didn't touch a drop. At the end of that 5-year period of time, I went to a training in Chicago. I live in, at that time, in Southern California. I went to a training in Chicago, and I was on my own, and I had my own hotel room. And it just occurred to me that certainly at the end of 5 years of not drinking, I was cured of whatever it was my problem was with alcohol. And so I could drink again normally, right? So I went to the bar, and the first night I went to the bar, I drank normally. I was fine, had a drink, no problem. The next night, had a couple of drinks, no problem. Got home, and by the time I was home, within a week, I was back to drinking alcohol again. And from that time on, I went on about a 9-year bender. Anyway, what happened in terms of how I managed to get to AA, the story on that one is that at the age of about 14 and a half years old, my wife and I discovered that my daughter was drinking and using drugs. And that kind of took us by surprise. We got her into an outpatient family and child therapy group that was 12-step oriented, 12-step related, and she got sober. Reluctantly, but she got sober. At the end of being sober for a year, her mother and I were supposed to give her her first 1-year chip, 1-year anniversary. The day that we were supposed to do that, my daughter caught me drinking and using. And after I had promised that I wouldn't drink and use while she was in the program. It's funny as I think back about that too. I actually had stopped when she went into the program. I actually had stopped drinking, but I couldn't do the God thing. I just never, ever had any kind of relationship with a higher power. So I tried a program back then called Rational Recovery, and I was able to stop drinking for about 6 months on that program. But at the end of the 6-month period, inevitably, I went back, and I was lying about it, and I was hiding it, I was cheating it, and doing all the things that people like me do. And the day that we were supposed to give her her 1-year anniversary chip, she caught me with my hand in the cookie jar, and that was my bottom. I know the exact day of that date. It was the 5th of January, 1999. And on the 5th of January, 1999, I made a decision that I've been able to live with for the last 22 years. That decision was I could never drink again. I was sure of it. It was no longer a question of whether maybe someday I'd be normal enough to drink. That was completely kicked out of me. The next day, the 6th of January, her counselor brought me to my first AA meeting. And when I got there, I had what I call the gift of desperation, what alcoholics euphemistically refer to as sick and tired of being sick and tired. Well, I was there, but it wasn't on the surface. It was in my bones. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired forever. And I only had two solutions, one of which was pretty unacceptable to me because it was permanent. And the other solution was to never drink again. And I didn't know how that was going to work because I had fashioned my entire life, my entire adult life around drinking. And I didn't know how that was going to work. So I came into AA. She brought me into AA, that first AA meeting on the 6th of January. And I had made a couple of decisions. The first decision I had made was I was completely, totally positive that while I could stop drinking, I could not stay stopped on my own. That much I was absolutely dead sure of, that there was no way I could stop drinking without some kind of help. And the second thing I was pretty sure of was that I couldn't think my way out of it anymore. I was raised with a fairly good brain, and most of the things that I applied myself to in the course of my life I could accomplish. But the one thing I could never accomplish was I could never stop drinking and stay stopped on my own. I just couldn't do it, and I knew it. So I came in, and the decision I made there was somehow, some way, whatever I found there, I was going to have to turn my will and my life over to. Not God. Remember, I'm not a God guy. Not God, but something somewhere inside that room, in that meeting, that night, I had to cling to find some kind of answer in there that I could turn my will and my life over to stop drinking forever. And I did. And I did. And the reason I did, I'm convinced, is because I was ready. I went into that first meeting that night. I was introduced to a man who the next day I would ask to sponsor me. He was my sponsor for 15 years until he died of hepatitis C. And a guy by the name of Rick R. stood up that night. Rick R. was a low bottom drunk. I'm a high bottom drunk. I lost very little as a result of my drinking. I lost a couple of jobs, but they were meaningless. I never crashed a car. I never went to jail. I never went to a recovery situation, a detox. None of those things. I never had any of those experiences. And I was able to maintain, I was able to drink and maintain some kind of semblance of a functioning life. But that night, I sat there and I listened to this guy who at that time had 9 years sober tell me a story that was so heartrending and so black and so dark, where his alcoholism had taken him and what it had taken him to get sober and how he had gotten sober and how his sobriety was working for him, that it touched my heart. And I knew as a result of hearing him that if that man could get sober after what he had gone through in his life, I did not have an excuse. There was no way I couldn't get sober if that guy got sober. The one thing I was absolutely sure of is what he was telling me was the truth. I could feel that he was telling me the truth, that he was telling me the truth. I knew that I had heard that. And so I came away from that meeting that night And the decision that I made was I was going to call this gentleman that I had met there, and I was going to turn my will and my life over to him. And I was going to do whatever he suggested, because that's what we do here. We suggest. But I was going to take his suggestions as if he was my drill sergeant and I was in the military. Anything he suggested to me, I was going to do unquestioningly. Now, I don't know that I would recommend that for anybody else, but fortunately, it worked beautifully for me. The man that I met that night read me like a book, sort of knew me from the inside out, certainly knew me better than I knew myself. Knew that he didn't have to push me very hard, that I really was willing to do whatever he asked me to do. He got that message because I proved it early on. And it was the typical message, go to 90 meetings in 90 days, don't drink between meetings, and call me every day. And so I went to, God, way more than 90 meetings in 90 days. And I didn't drink between the meetings, and I called him every day. He says, if I'm not home, leave a message on my answering machine. He wasn't home, I left a message on his answering machine. Whatever that man asked me to do, I did. And it worked. But what really worked for me when I first came into the program was connecting to the fellowship. It was unquestionably, it was the fellowship that got me sober. One of the things that I heard very early on in the meetings was, if you want to know, if you want to have what we have, then here's what you do. Get yourself a sponsor. Do what your sponsor asks you to do, the mantra. And then if you want to find out if there's a life after alcohol, come with us and we'll show you. And the first time I heard that, I went to my sponsor and I said, hey, I have this sort of open invitation to go with these people wherever they go and do whatever they're doing to see how they're managing to remain sober and seemingly happy and content with their sobriety. Should I do that? And his instant answer was, absolutely. Go as often as you can. One of the things that I'm very fortunate about was that the fellowship that I fell into was in a lot of action, lots and lots of action. At the end of every meeting, and that was a fellowship that traveled too, by the way, that wasn't in a club or anything. That fellowship went from point to point to point to point. And I would follow them around. And at the end of every single meeting, the question was asked, is anyone going to have a panel? Are you going anywhere? Hospitals, institutions, prisons, whatever. If you are, would you please let us know? And if there are people that would like to go along with you, they can talk to you at the end of the meeting. Invariably at the end of every single meeting I went to, somebody would stand up and say, I'm taking a panel to such and such a state hospital, or I'm taking a panel to such and such a prison, or I'm taking a panel to this place, or I'm taking a panel to that place. If anybody would like to go, come talk to me. Well, at the end of every meeting, I would go to them and talk to them, and I'd say, can I go? And I never got a no. Of course, the answer was, yeah, sure. Here's where we're going. We'll either pick you up or you can drive yourself there, either way. And this is the time we'll be there. Come join us. And I did. And it got me completely sober. That sobriety, and there was one other thing that my sponsor recommended. He said, take lots of commitments. If you go to a meeting, be of service in some way. Be of service in that meeting. If there's nothing else for anybody has for you to do specifically in that meeting, stand out front and greet people as they come in. At the end of the meeting, help clean up, put chairs away, do whatever. And I did that as well. And I'm telling you, within a week of being in AA meetings, going to a meeting every single day, something profound had changed inside of me. I was doing something that I hadn't really ever done in my life. I was connecting to a social group and becoming part of. I was always an isolating drinker. I was not a social drinker. The last 5 years of my drinking, I drank alone. And that's how I like to drink. When I got into AA, those days were over. I couldn't isolate anymore. I didn't want to isolate. I had found a place where the people that were there accepted me for exactly who I was, were glad to see me, who wanted me to be part of their deal, and very largely had a very consistent message. And it was everybody kind of pulling the same direction and inviting me to join them to pull in that same direction that I found very appealing, because my life was very unstructured. And what they were offering me was very structured, very structured. And I needed that kind of structure. I needed the fellowship, I needed the camaraderie of other people, and I needed to be pulling in the same direction they were pulling in. So what I did when I came in was I put the God thing aside. I did the first 3 steps several times, but I never really could grab a hold of the God thing, but I just kind of let it go. I didn't fight it, and got into step 4 pretty much as quickly as I could. That took a while. It didn't happen immediately, but it took a little while to get there. But that's where I knew I had to get to, and that's what I did. So the other thing that was kind of interesting is I went into a detox after I was sober 45 days. And that's kind of unusual, because most of the people that go into detox don't go into detox sober. But I did. I had gotten sober for 45 days, and I went into detox primarily to save my marriage and to save my relationship with my daughter. The thing that was interesting about going into detox is that after 45 days of being in the program, I knew I would never drink again. That wasn't not being arrogant about that. I just knew from the inside out I would never drink again. So I went into detox for a 28-day, what we call spin dry in Southern California. And while I was there, I ran into a physician who was the primary physician that was dealing in that detox unit. His name was Drew Pinsky. He's also known as Dr. Drew, and he's all over YouTube. If anybody wants to look him up, you can go find him. And he was considered at that time, and still is considered to be, one of the foremost addictionologists in the country. And the thing I remember most about him is that he came into my room with his little board, and he was going to do an intake. And he asked me a question about my family background. And he said, "You claim to be an alcoholic. Are there any alcoholics in your family?" And I said, "No, not really." He says, "Well, what's your background?" I said, "Well, I was raised in a Jewish family. My mother is Jewish, and I was raised in a Jewish family. I'm adopted." And he said, "That's not right." And I looked at it and said, "What do you mean that's not right?" He said, "The drug of choice among Jewish people isn't alcohol, it's opium." He said, "There's something else going on with you." And I said to him, "Well, the only thing I know is that I was adopted, and that my father's people had immigrated here from Scotland." And he slammed his hand on his knee and he looked at me and he said, "That's it. That's why you're an alcoholic." And then we had a brief discussion about the demographics of drug addiction and drug abuse, and how, depending upon what part of the world your ancestors came from, depends very largely, if you're an addict or an alcoholic, on your drug of choice. I had no idea that the drug of choice for people that are from the British Isles and from South America and Central America is alcohol, and that the drug of choice of people who are in the Middle East and India and those places is opium. Because those are the typical situations. I didn't realize, how that alcoholism played in until I was much, much older. But in any event, I spent 28 days in that spin dry and came out and went right straight into step 4. All right. So what's it like now? Let's go a little bit further, because I have a little more time. Okay. The God thing didn't bother me early on. I even was saying the Lord's Prayer at the end of the meetings and this, serenity prayer at the beginning and reading the readings and, doing all the thing, and just reciting the words like that was just something you said to be part of the program, not because I necessarily believed it. But over the course of time, I didn't rail against it. I never really fought it. It just never stuck. And over the course of time, slowly but surely, I started going to fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer meetings. Didn't happen all at once. I was really embedded in AA for the first, I'd say 2 to 3 years. I was going to a meeting every day. But after that, it started to peel off. I moved to the Pacific Northwest in 2016. By the time I got here, I was going to one meeting a week. It was my home group. It was a Sunday morning meeting. And the man who led that meeting was an atheist and had no problem telling you he was an atheist. And I was real comfortable in that meeting because although it was a traditional meeting and we did all the readings, it was pretty clear that it was, the whole God thing was kind of loosely adopted there. So I came up here, and when I came to the Pacific Northwest, I was, I'm 22 years sober. I was 17 years sober at the time. I just didn't need meetings anymore. I hadn't needed meetings to stay sober for a very long time. And I got here and I didn't go to a meeting for 2 years. No online meetings, no face-to-face meetings, no meetings at all. That was 2016. I was playing in a little house band here, and the bass player in the bass band and the group that I was in was a horrible, and still is a horrible alcoholic. And he managed to break his back by trying to carry something up the stairs in his house drunk and fell over backwards and broke his back. And we needed another bass player because he was going to take a little time to recover from that. And the guy who led the group, very good friend of mine, went to his guitar teacher and said, "We need a bass player. Do you know anybody?" And he says, "Yeah, I might know someone." And this guy came over. His name was Dan. This guy came over and played bass and started talking. And you know how we are? It's almost, you can almost instantaneously recognize people who are in program just by the way they present. And this guy obviously was one of us. He was obviously a friend of Bill's, just the way he was presenting. The way he was using words and the words that he was using were clear as a bell to me that this guy was in program. So during the break, I went up to him and I said, "How long you been in AA?" And he said, and I think at that time it was something along the lines of 35 years, 36 years, something like that. And so we shared that, and he says to me, "Where are you going to meetings?" And I said, "I'm not." And he said, "You are now." Said, "I'll pick you up at 7:30. And he did. And I went to the first AA meeting I had been to in 2 years with that guy that night. And it was a traditional AA meeting. It was a small meeting in the basement of a church. Most of the people there were people that had quite a bit of time. There were, a couple of people with 2-3 years of sobriety, but there were also a bunch of people there with 30-40 years of sobriety. And I connected, I'm at home in AA. I'm at home in traditional AA. And so I sat down and I got into the meeting. But it didn't take long from the time I was there. By the time I was going, that's the only meeting I went to. But I went to that meeting every Monday night. And it was pretty clear to me fairly early on what it was about traditional AA meetings I didn't like. And the thing I didn't like about traditional AA meetings were those damn readings, the prayers, and all the stuff that I just could not get my arms around or cling to. So this is 2019, probably October, November, somewhere in there. I made a decision. I had heard that there was this thing called secular AA. I wanted to find out what the heck that was all about. So I went online because I'm very comfortable with computers. I went online and I Googled secular AA. And sure enough, it turned out that there were actually three secular AA meetings, 2 or 3 secular AA meetings, 5 miles from my home. Literally right down, I could practically walk to them. And so I made a decision. I said, well, I have to go see what these are about. They were face-to-face meetings. I have to go see what these meetings are about. And I went to one of them, it was a Wednesday night, and that was based on the little book. You guys know the little book, the one that has all the various AA readings in it. It's like 20 different variations of the 12 steps, except from a secular perspective. And the format of that meeting is somebody, the leader, whoever the leader was going to be, would pick one of those readings and they would read that 12 step, that variation of the 12 step. And then we would discuss it in the group. That's how that meeting worked. And I got a copy of the book and I read through it, read all those steps. They all felt good. They all seemed reasonable to me. And I said, okay, this might be a fit for me. But there was another meeting that took place on Sunday morning, another face-to-face meeting that took place on Sunday morning that was a secular meeting. And I said, now let me try that one. And I went to that secular meeting on Sunday morning. That one was based on the current day's reading from a book called Beyond Belief. And I know a lot of you guys are familiar with that book. It's available on Amazon. And it's a daily reader and it's secular. And I attended one of those meetings and I was home. I mean, it was instantaneous. I knew at that moment, just like I knew 22 years earlier, 21 years, 20 years earlier, that I was done drinking forever. I knew that from the point that I was at that meeting, that would be my home forever. This was it. This was going to be AA for me from now on. And I went to a couple of more meetings. And then I went to my friend Dan and I said to him, and now this guy, remember, this guy's 36, 37 years sober in traditional AA and goes to meetings all the time, very active in AA. And I said, but he's also a scientist. He's also a scientist. So I appealed to his scientific side and I say, you really ought to try this secular meeting, Now remember, he's the guy that got me back into AA after having not gone to a meeting for 2 years. So I'm going to him suggesting that he take a look at secular AA just for laughs and giggles. Just for laughs and giggles. And he said, okay, I'll do it. And the next Sunday, he and I went to that secular meeting, and he pretty much found in that secular meeting what I found in that secular. It was a home. It worked for him. Largely what was working for him was what worked for me, which was the depth and breadth of the topics that we were getting into. It was wonderful. It was refreshing. It wasn't restricted to AA literature. God wasn't in the room. It was very, very appealing to both of us. That was late in 2019 when all that happened. Anybody else remember what happened late in 2019? Still happening to this day? Yeah, it was called the pandemic. Literally, we got to go to maybe 2 or 3 face-to-face meetings, and then they closed down. Why? Because there was a pandemic going on, and everybody was scared to death of it. It's called coronavirus. And at that point then, but I was hooked. I was hooked on secular AA. I was hooked on secular AA practically from the get-go. I had to figure out whether or not there was some way I could remain connected to secular AA. And so once again, back to Google, get on Google and start searching for secular AA meetings. And pretty much the first one I find is Courtney and Secular Recovery Group. And I get into that, and I'm really fortunate because secular Zoom, I never used Zoom, I never used Skype, I never did anything like I'm doing right now, but I figured out how to use it. And I just fell in love with it. I just felt at home with it. I got into the SRG meetings, secular. They didn't call them secular recovery group then; it was called secular A, whatever it was. Anyway, I got into those meetings, and they started working for me, and I could connect with the people on here, and I could feel at home. And the most important thing was it was practically as potent for me to be in these rooms with you people on this platform as it was for me to go physically to a traditional AA or a secular AA meetings and sit in those rooms and be with you in person. That worked for me. Doesn't work for everybody, but it sure as hell worked for me. So I call my friend Dan, and they say, "Hey, Dan, looky what I found." And so he started going to, he himself checked it out, started going to secular AA meetings. And the rest, as they say, is history. Dan became very involved in secular AA. And I pretty much go to a secular AA meeting every day. So that's kind of how I got here. And he and I are still very close. We see each other all the time. He still plays in the band that I'm in. And so we do music together and we do AA together. And man, that consumes a lot of our life. And I love that. I love being able to share that with him. So in any event, that's kind of the arc of my sobriety from the time I was 18 till now. I'm 70. I'll be 77 years old in May. I'm 22 years sober. And I don't know very much for sure, but there's one thing I know for sure. I will die sober. I would rather die than drink. Alcohol and I suffered an acrimonious divorce on the 5th of January, 1999. There is no going back. Sometimes you bump into things in life and you know at the end of the time that you've had with those things that they're done and that they're over and that there's no going back. There is no going back to alcohol for this alcohol. There hasn't been for 22 years. I cannot conceive of anything in my life that would make me willing to go back to the way I felt the day I bought it. Whoa. I think we are checking out a 50-mile-an-hour gust here, folks. I made it. I made it, BriJet. Anyway, I'll end with this. I love secular AA. I adore it. It's a big part of my day every day to be in here and in these meetings with you. My program wears faces, and I get to see those faces every time I'm in an AA meeting and on this platform. And I carry you. I carry the memory of your faces around with me when I'm not here. You are my sobriety. You are what I cling to. I've always felt that the fellowship was what kept me sober. And to this day, it's the fellowship that keeps me sober. And that, folks, is you. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Great to hear from you.